literally almost fell off the stool. Hello, everybody. Today we get to go through more responses that current med students from across the country gave to a survey I sent out that asked just one question. What's the best, most helpful piece of advice that you got as a pre-med that helped you in applying or going through medical school? I got tons of responses. There are some funny ones, some serious ones, and pretty much all of them are things that I wish I'd known as a pre-med. Be sure to watch to the end because I saved some of my favorite responses for last. Before we get going, don't forget to subscribe and share with your medically inclined friends and family. Now let's get going. So let's start out with the biggest theme or common thread that I found through a lot of the responses, which was stay away from the comparison game. One student says, stay true to your story and know you're worth it. It's tough thinking that people all around you have better scores and better everything else, but know that your unique story is what'll get you into a good school and believe in yourself the whole journey. Confidence goes a long way. Smiley face. Love that. Wonderful, wonderful advice. And another student simply says, run your own race. And yet another student says to not worry about what others are doing. Each person has a unique path. While there are essentials, i.e. clinical experience, shadowing, volunteering, etc., there are many ways to fulfill those requirements. Choosing quality over quantity will show come application interview time. And this is absolutely true. I'm on the admissions committee at my med school, and it's very clear to, if not on your application, then definitely at the interview, you can tell if an applicant is just doing stuff to check boxes, quantity, or if you're really putting in some good, solid, consistent effort and you really are true to your interests. It's night and day. Along these same lines, this other student went a step further, and I'm glad they did this. They said, please do not, all caps, touch SDN, Student Doctor Network, with a 10-foot pole. There is no one-size-fits-all method for applying to medical school. Put your blinders on, put in the work, and you will get there. Yes, 100%. And some pre-meds say, oh, well, if I shouldn't look at SDN, then where should I go to ask questions and get real answers? And actually, another student has a great suggestion, an alternative to SDN, if you will. Reddit. As for applying to medical school, if you go to an undergrad that doesn't have a lot of pre-med counseling, I suggest using Reddit. Someone told me to make an account, and I started roaming around about a year before I applied. And I don't think I would have known what I needed to do in order to be competitive had it not been for Reddit. People on there give advice a lot, can help you build school lists, and they even have secondary/personal statement services. I used this heavily when I applied, and it worked out for me. People gave really good feedback, but also use it sparingly if you start to get stressed from it. Bottom line, there are a lot of resources out there and a lot of forums that you can ask questions and kind of get some feedback on your application and craft it nicely. But there is definitely such a thing as too much feedback and information overload. Take advice when you need it, but ultimately you have to be confident in your own abilities and decision making because this is your application, which reflects you as a person, someone that an admissions committee will be impressed by. And finally, on the same topic of getting out of that comparison mindset, one last student here says, best advice I've received when applying to med schools is not compare my timeline with another's. People might get interviews before you and be accepted before you. Everything has its own perfect timing. So long as you are doing everything you can and placing in genuine effort, you'll get where you want to be. Yes, absolutely. And sometimes that takes a couple of cycles, like we talked about in the part 1 video of best advice from med students. And I stand by this last one for sure. Definitely don't, set your heart on getting in your first try, and don't get discouraged if you don't get in the first or even the second round. Some of the best physicians I know applied 3 or 4 times to get into med school. Sometimes it takes a while, but absolutely it's worth the time and effort to reapply if medicine is truly what you want to do. And comparing yourself to others in this process is not helpful. It's toxic and it does not work before, during, or after med school. It's not a healthy mindset to have just as a human. So let's avoid that. Okay, that's it. I'm off my soapbox. Let's move on. Oh, here's one that I swear by. Look, start journaling early on to keep track of your volunteer hours, clinical experience, shadowing, research, study abroad, etc. It makes it easy to write down the hours when you fill out your applications and helps with writing the essay/personal statement. Oh, this is something that I did as a pre-med, like literally the only thing that I heard about that I actually did. I never would have remembered all of the dates that I did things, the hours that added up, the contact information for all of the organizations and volunteer whatever that I did. It's so hard to keep track of all of that if you don't just write it down as you're doing it. Because, you're a pre-med for 4+ years. That's a lot of time to remember stuff. Yeah, save yourself the trouble. Just write it down as you go along. That's it. Now let's talk about the ones that hit on the all-important MCAT. Couple of shorties here first. Your MCAT score does not matter as much as you think it does. And also, you are not your MCAT. I know everyone's like, well, that doesn't mean it's not important. Yeah, obviously it's a factor, but, and this depends on the institution. Some institutions probably factor MCAT in more than others. But, for example, on my admissions committee, it's a factor, but it's not going to necessarily make or break your application. The rest of your app combined easily overcomes any mediocre MCAT score. Honestly, the MCAT by itself does not indicate that you're going to be a successful, good med student and future physician. And med schools know that. They have this objective, standardized number, but at the end of the day, they're not admitting numbers, they're admitting people. At least that's what my institution, and I would imagine many others, do and are doing more of these days. Another student says, work part-time / go to school part-time when studying for the MCAT if you're able. You want to be fully focused when studying for this horrendous exam, and the only way you can do that is if you don't have hard classes to worry about or a demanding job that will drain your studying when you come home. Now, I think this very much depends on the person. I totally agree. For me, it was really, really difficult to study for the MCAT and go to school full-time and work. I found it helpful to, back off on a little bit of work and back off a little bit on school while I was studying for the MCAT. And I imagine that works for a lot of people, but some people are superhuman and they can work 40 hours and do 17 credits and MCAT study on top of that. Good for you. It totally just depends on the person. Be honest with yourself about how much time you're really going to need, because the last thing that you want to do is feel like you should have given yourself more time or that you weren't fully prepared and then you underperformed on the exam because of it. Oh, now here's one that I would have never thought of ever, but it's totally true. Since CASPer is so heavily used nowadays with medical school, I recommend getting the BeMo book. BeMo, I don't know. I also recommend getting Dr. Ryan Gray's personal statement book when trying to craft your personal statement. Now, I personally have not bought or read either of those books, but someone does recommend them. They might be worth looking into, and I will put the links to them in the description box below if you want to check them out. Oh, here's a brutally honest one. Are y'all ready? Okay, it's super sarcastic, but it also highlights something that's really important that a lot of pre-meds worry about. Be born rich. This is an expensive process. If you're rich, you can afford all the expensive tutoring for MCAT and flex that score on your classmates later. I mean, obviously they're being pretty facetious. No one flexes their MCAT score actually in med school. But also the part that is true is that this is a very expensive process, and I'm sure most pre-meds know this by now, and surely all med students do. I had a friend who literally spent $12,000 on MCAT prep, apps, and interviews. But please know that you do not have to do this. You may have people around you, other pre-meds around you, being like, oh, I'm shelling out. You don't need to spend $12,000 to get into med school. I didn't do a prep course. I only applied to 9 schools, and I traveled cheap for interviews, and I think I spent literally just under $1,000 for the entire process. The point is, yes, it can be very expensive, but there are also ways to lower those expenses and make it all much more financially manageable. But that's a big topic, and we can save that for another video. So I love this next response. I live for simplicity. This student has one word for you all. Anki. And another one. learn to use Anki inside out. And a third student adds some context to the Anki thing here. I think the best piece of advice for going through medical school is that we don't have to change every single study habit that we have. If it worked amazingly well in undergrad, it should work for medical school as well. Of course, learn to be adaptable and figure out early on what will work and what doesn't because of the vast amount of information, but you definitely do not have to follow what everyone is doing. If you are a contextual learner, then stick to understanding first, then memorize later. But I know there are plenty of people who will just use Anki to rote memorize things, and that works for them. And I'll just add my personal experience to this. I have found Anki extremely useful for drilling certain things into my brain and keeping up on things that I learned in the past. For spaced repetition, which is a very well-established, solid learning method for a lot of people, and customizability, Anki is the way to go for most students. Plus, it's free on a laptop or desktop, and we love that. I put in a few hours of learning how to use it up front when med school started, and I'm really glad that I did. In fact, I wish I'd used it in undergrad, so I definitely echoed these other student suggestions. And also those different learning styles that third comment was talking about, something that I went more in depth on in the How I Study for 80 Hours Without Burning Out video, which I will link above. And that's it. We just went through the rest of the best advice that current med students from across the country have for pre-meds and incoming med students. I am so grateful to all of those who responded to the survey. These responses were so insightful and funny and all stuff that I really wish that I had known as a pre-med, and so I hope that this video was helpful. Thank you so much to all those who responded to this survey and shared your med student wisdom with the pre-meds and incoming med students out there. I hope all of you who are in the application process or starting this coming fall got a couple of takeaways from this video. And if you thought this was helpful, please leave a like down below, subscribe, and be sure to share with your pre-med and med student friends and family. Thanks so much for watching and hope to see you next week.